Let's take a look at how you look up values in Excel through functions. This is very useful if you're building formulas that you want to automate. So in this example, we're going to do VLOOKUPs, HLOOKUPs, and index, and these correspond to the table above. And the table you'll see has columns 1 through 5 and rows 1 through 5 with corresponding letters assigned. If I take a look at the first vertical lookup, the actual lookup's taking place here in F10. If I look at the formula, it's telling us to find value D10, which is X, and it's trying to find it within C4 to G7. So if I highlight that, you'll see it's finding it within this box. And it's going to find the X here then, which is going to be row 3. By having false in the last statement position here, it's going to tell it it has to find X or nothing. And let's say X doesn't exist here, and we go from W to Y and then to Z, and I told it to find X. If I had this as a true instead, it would find W, and then it would see Y, and it would realize X should be between W and Y, and since it isn't, it would then take W instead, the first one that it found the closest. So that's the difference between a true and false. But in this case, I want to match exactly, and if I can't find it, then I don't want anything to happen. So I'm going to have a false in that fourth term there. And then I have a 4, and what 4 corresponds to is the column number, how deep I want to go into this lookup. So the lookup is going to assume that the first column are the values that you're looking up against. It's going to take that D10 and find it in that first column then, and then it's going to go over however many rows, which is 4 in this case, until it finds the intersection, and that should be 7. And that's exactly what we have then for a value, and it's a 7. A nice thing is that these are all live, so let's say that this changes to 5. If it changes to 5 and we're on an X5, let's see, I have that hard coded, that's why that did that. So let me instead put this on a formula here. There we go. So now if I change this column and do like a 4, you'll see it goes to a 7, and if I have a 5, it goes to an 8. So it's definitely switching between these two automatically. So that's the value of these lookups. You can automate things like this within your formulas and on the lookups. And another thing we can do is, let's say we want to instead go off a name here, and in this case it's the letter C instead of telling it column 4, because we might not know what column that C resides in. So here we have the luxury of knowing it's 4, so we can hard code that in. But instead, if we wanted to automatically find that, if you look at this formula, I'm using, instead of 4, another function which is called match. And here I'm telling it to find the letter C, which is at E11, in this row. So I'm going from C3 all the way over to G5, and then I have a 0 at the end, which tells it that it has to have the absolute value of C once again. And that will then count down, and you'll see it's going to start here at the front position. So 1, 2, 3, 4, and that will give us a 4 then into the formula. If I hit F9 in that partial formula, you should be able to see let me see, F9. Yeah, that didn't work on my keyboard. If I hit F9, it should show that. I have another function working that's overriding that right now. But if you hit F9, it would have shown you that it is a 4 position. Then you have HLOOKUPs, and on HLOOKUPs, it's working the same way, except now instead of going up and down this vertical column, it's going to go across this horizontal row. And here I'm going to find 4B once again. And you can see that the 4 is going to go into the same type of position, but here it's going to be row 4. And then it's going to look for the horizontal value, E12, which is B. And it's going to look for it in that same block, essentially, that we had it looking before. But this one's working horizontally and then coming down the number of rows that you tell it to. So the same type of formula, and I can do a match in this case as well. And instead of having the hard-coded row ID number here of 4, and with the match case it will work the same way and find 4 for us. That way you can have whatever order you want in items and it will find it in the lists then. And finally there's a index technique, and here I'm trying to find a row and column simultaneously, and in the row and column you'll see I'm using what's called an index. An index is going to tell it to find within this whole block a row and column number. Now to find the row and column number, I'm using match cases in each of those, and I'm looking them up just like I did in the VLOOKUP and HLOOKUP up above, and that will ultimately give me a column and row then, index, and then I'll find that value. So in this case it's going to find 6, so 6 would correspond to B and X, which it's doing. And you can also create this index look through a VLOOKUP. So in this VLOOKUP, all I'm doing is I'm telling it to find D15, which is the X, and I'm doing a match in that case, which I showed you earlier you could do on the VLOOKUPs and HLOOKUPs. And if I find a match then of 15, of E15, that would be the B, and I'm going to look for that in C3 to G3. So here you have C3 to G3, so it's going to find it in this row here, B. So that would then correspond to column 3, and then that would of course give us the 6 when you come down to the X. And you can do the same for an HLOOKUP, and once again these are fully automated. So we have X and B, so what if we had X and D instead? So if I change this to D, automatically you see that the value changed to 8, and that's the power of doing indexes and lookups. A few other functions in Excel that exist. One is a SUMIFS and a COUNTIFS. So there's a SUMIF, there's also a SUMIFS, and in this case I'm going to use the SUMIFS and the COUNTIFS. So you can have multiple lookups if you wanted to. And if we go to a SUMIF, what I'm telling it to do here is I have D4 to D7. So you can see I have D4, which is going to be right here, and down to D7. So I'm choosing this whole block here. And then I'm telling it to sum this if, and then I have a B4 to B7. So now I'm down on this row here. And I'm telling it sum it if the value in this row is equal to, and in this case I'm telling it the letter 3. And I'm also putting in another condition that the value in this column here has to also equal X. So what I've done is I put two conditions in the lookup in this case, and it's going to look up the value then in the column A, so right here, but it's going to have the criteria of the first column and the second column in finding that. So if you take a look at 3 and X, what will you find is you find row 3. So we're going to first make sure it's in the row 3, and also that it has the letter X, and then it's going to grab the value in that first column of A. And that's exactly what's happening here. Now what if I change this to 3Y, which means that we don't have a match anymore, and in that case it shouldn't find anything. So I'm going to change this to Y now, and you'll see it changes to 0 and no count of items found. So that function is working. So once again we'd have to bring this back to X for it to work from the way I set it up. And we have a 4Z, and here we have a 4 and Z. Those are a mismatch because we'll never find that first and second column matching, which they would need to do in order to then grab the value in the third. So that's the power of a SUMIFS. You can have multiple lookup criteria. Now the weakness of a SUMIF is that everything has to be kind of linear here, in that you're going to be looking up values in different columns, and then if they meet the criteria, then it will grab the next column over. So that's the type of thing that you do with a SUMIF and a COUNTIF. COUNTIF is pretty much the same structure, but here you don't have to sum values. All you're doing is counting. So here you just give it the criteria in the first and second columns, and if it meets it, it will add it to the count. You don't have to run over to the third column here and actually do a sum. So that's the way that these work. And then if you want to get an average value, you can't do it through these functions, but obviously you have a sum and a count, so now you could get an average if you just want to divide the sum by the counts. So that's another type of lookup that exists. And finally, our array formulas, and this is the most powerful and probably useful. And array formulas, here I have extended that first example to several more columns. And you'll see that I have letter values that are repeated, D's and C's, and A and B are unique. Now I have the row identifier that I'm trying to find here, and I have the column identifier that I'm trying to find here. Now the sum, if you look at the formula here, I'm saying sum if, and then I have C3 to C7. So we're dealing with C3 to C7. So if these values are equal to W. So obviously it should only find that first row. Row number 2 here. The next if that I have, and you see I'm stacking ifs here, and you can stack as many ifs as you want and as many conditions as you want, and that's the power of doing an array formula. But here I have the second criteria, and I say if C3 to I3. So there I'm looking at this row of values here, so all these different column headers. So if that equals D10, so now I'm looking for an A. Okay? So if this formula is working right, it's going to sum whatever is in the intersection of W and A, and that should be 1. And if I look, it has a 1, and it only occurs once. So that's formula is working. Now something I should mention, that when you go up here and when you edit an array formula, you need to hit Control-Shift-Enter to put the array formula in, and you can tell when it's in because you'll see the little bird brackets, the curly brackets on both sides, and that tells you that you have an array formula. Now count is identical. So unlike the SUMIFS and COUNTIFS, here you're going to use the identical formula. The only difference is that you say count at the front of it versus sum at the front of this one. Once I create that array formula, I can just copy and paste it down. So you don't have to do the Control-Shift-Enter after you do it once. So I'll just show you that once again. I'll bring it down here and say paste those functions, and you see nothing changed. It's the same numbers. So you can copy these pretty easy. You can drag them, really do anything you want with them. Now let's see what XB gives me. So X and B should give me 6. So that's working, and it only occurs once. Now here's the real power of an array formula. You can't do this any other way in Excel with any other functions. Let's say I have a Y and a C. Well, here I have a Y. It only occurs once, so that means it's going to run down this row. But if you look, I have a C here and a C here in F and column 8, F and H. So that means that it's going to find this value, and it's going to find this value, the 11 and the 121. It should sum those together, and that should equal 131. And sure enough, you have 131 as a value. Now, how many items went into that sum? Well, that's what the count is going to tell me. And sure enough, I did the 11 and 120 together. So it's a count of 2, and we have 2. Now Z, let's see if that works. Z is here. It's going to run across the row. We're looking for a D. And if we see a D up here, we also have another D over here. So we're going to have 2 different items. It's going to be a 16 and a 1600 added together. And that is the number that we have, 1,616 with a count of 2. And as I've already said, the power of this stuff is that it's live. So let's say that we want to have a ZB. A ZB should only be 14 and a count of 1. So let's do a B here. And sure enough, we have 14 and a count of 1. So array formula is very powerful. You can really do anything with them, and looking up an item in an intersection like an index on a matrix. But if your matrix is going to roll over and have repetitive values that you need to sum on either rows or columns, this is a great way to do it.